Infinite Crisis by Greg Cox, book review. So this is a bit of a strange one. This is a novelization of a comic book. So the comic book is Infinite Crisis. This is the novel form of that, which I guess raises the obvious question: why would anyone read the novelization of a comic book? Why not just read the comic book itself? In my case, I was going through a phase around about the time this came out where I had just read Stephen King's book on writing. And Stephen King recommended that if you want to become a good writer, just read everything you can get your hands on. He said, a good book will improve your writing abilities because it will show you what to do. And he said a bad book will improve your writing abilities because it will show you what not to do, but just read anything and everything. And I took that as my excuse to just read a whole bunch of junk that year. And a lot of that is going to come through in these book reviews. Some of that has come through already. But yeah, this is just part of that junk. It's just kind of finding the novelization of a comic book and then reading it through. So that's my excuse. Now, of course, when they published this book, they didn't publish it with just me in mind, right? This book was kind of mass-produced and sold to a wide audience. So why was everybody else reading it? Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'll just throw that question out to the internet. Why would anyone else read the novelization of a comic book? Anyways, the comic book on which this is based is Infinite Crisis. Now, if you're not already intimately familiar with the history of DC Comics, this is going to get a bit weird. And I don't want to try and recap everything here. So I'll just kind of try and give a brief summary, and then, If you really want to understand what's going on, you can kind of go to Wikipedia, or somebody's probably got a YouTube video explaining the whole thing. But basically, DC Comics evolved into somewhat of a convoluted continuity in the 60s and 70s, where they had so many different superheroes from so many different time periods that they just kind of decided that all these superheroes are living in different universes. So the Green Lantern and the Flash from the 1940s are living in one universe, and the Green Lantern and the Flash from the 1960s are living in another universe. They also kind of acquired the rights to a lot of other comic books in the 60s and 70s, like Quality Comics and Charleston Comics and Fawcett Comics. So all those superheroes were living in their respective universes. In 1986, they finally decided that things had gotten so kind of confusing for new readers that they wanted to merge it into one universe. There's that, and I think Secret Wars by Marvel Comics, which had come out the year before, had proved that these huge crossover events are big sellers. So rather than just kind of merging everything quietly, they made this huge crossover event to explain why all these different comic books series are merging. So that was called Crisis on Infinite Earths. 20 years later then, that Crisis on Infinite Earths was 1986. So 20 years later, in 2006, they did a sequel to it, or kind of a tribute, in which kind of the multiverse comes back, and some of these characters who had been kind of out of comic books for 20 years, like Superman from Earth 2, which was like supposedly the original 1940s Superman, or Superboy from Earth Prime. I think Earth Prime is supposed to be like our Earth, except it's not our Earth. It's complicated. Anyways, there was like a sequel to the event, and I read it both in comic book form, and I read the novelization. This review is primarily a review of the novelization, but I'll touch on, I mean, obviously it's hard to separate them, so the story is largely the same. I had read, in fact I reviewed this separately on this channel, the novelization of the original Crisis on Infinite Earths by Marv Wolfman, which I found frustrating because the novelization gave me less detail than the comic book. I kind of figured that the whole point of trying to pick up a novelization was to get more detail. Infinite Crisis by Greg Cox is better in this regard. There's a lot of things that are confusing in the comic books. For example, some of those big fight scenes when a lot of kind of major characters are kind of getting killed off is a little bit confusing in the comic book. You're not quite sure who's getting kind of killed and who's kind of getting injured, and there's just a lot of things flying around. It's much more clear in the novel. Also, the novel brings in some of the side stories, which they're from the comics, but they're not collected in the graphic novel version of the comics. You know, the Infinite Crisis, the graphic novel, as you kind of buy it off the shelves, doesn't have kind of all the side stories. Some of those side stories are in the novel. The writing style is good enough. It's not perfect. Some of the sentences are a little bit sloppy. There's also an adjective or adverb attribution overload. So too many adjectives and adverbs going on. And what's known as Tom Swifties. Tom Swifties is kind of named after the novel series Tom Swift, in which they always kind of have an adverb to say how a character was talking. Like, he said angrily, he said happily, stuff like that. There's some debates over whether this is good writing or not, but it's usually mocked. Still, overall, overall I found it an enjoyable read, and I actually got more out of this than I think I did out of the comic on which it was based. Okay, now, the story itself. So, it's a little bit kind of difficult to separate the story itself from kind of editorializing on the whole policy, which is the habit DC Comics has of kind of resetting its universe every now and again. So the first big one, of course, was Infinite Crisis. No, sorry. Crisis on Infinite Earths. These names get confusing. So that was the one in 1986. Now, that frustrated a lot of long-term comic book fans because it erased years of continuity. And one of the reasons people get into comics is just this whole sense of continuity, the sense that all these stories are connected, and you don't want to miss a single issue because it's part of an ongoing story that might have kind of, you know, something that happens in issue 1 will later kind of show up in issue 35. I don't know. Admittedly, it's kind of a geek thing, but if you're a comic book geek, this is all part of the fun. And Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1986 just erased years of that, but arguably, they needed to do it because it was just too out of control with too many different universes, and they needed to kind of merge it into one universe. Then they did it again 10 years later with Zero Hour. Now, Zero Hour, again, I don't know what the purpose of it exactly was. It was just kind of an excuse to sell more comics with one of these big continuity changing events. But it was also trying to clean up a little bit some of the leftover continuity issues from Infinite Crisis. From Crisis on Infinite Earths, the first one. It was trying to clear up some lingering continuity issues from the first one. So, arguably they needed to do it. Now, with this one, Infinite Crisis, they're just kind of rebooting the universe again, and at this point it was kind of starting to get frustrating for me as a comic books fan. Although by this point, by 2006, I had kind of largely grown out of comics. So I had somewhat grown out of comics. I was just kind of looking in on this kind of from a somewhat outsider's perspective, as someone who just occasionally dipped into it. In the introduction to the book, Dan Dido, who was the editor of DC Comics, says, Julie Schwartz was the former DC editor. Julie Schwartz said that every 10 years, you need to give the universe an enema. You know, clear out all the old stories and make way for new tales, rife with infinite possibilities. Smart man, that Julie Schwartz. Yeah, I guess that's one view. And, you know, I can kind of understand this from like a writer's perspective, is that the more continuity they have, the more difficult it gets to write for these characters, and the more they kind of feel constrained by the old continuity. As a reader, though, I always felt like part of the fun of comic books was you were, you know, as a kid, kind of when you start to read comic books for the first time, the idea that you're stepping into this long story that goes back decades and is kind of much bigger than your generation. I always thought that was part of the fun. It's a debate, I guess. Different people have different preferences. Okay, having said all that, having said that I would just assume, have preferred they leave it alone and not reboot the universe every 10 years, I guess it's time to examine this story in particular. So leaving aside the broader implications and just talking about how this story did. I thought they did a really good job of it. It's the perfect story for a comic book geek. They brought back all the survivors of the original Crisis, Superman 2, Lois Lane 2, Superboy Prime, Alexander Luthor. They even briefly recreated the original multiverse, separating all the superheroes back to the universes where they originally came from. So kind of a nice nod to DC Comics pre-Crisis continuity. Now, as with the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, the body count gets pretty high. And again, like I said, this all happens so quickly in the comic book panels, it's a little bit difficult to tell what's going on. It's clearer in the novelization who's being killed and who's actually being injured. Now, interestingly enough, if you go back to the original Crisis on Infinite Earths, Marv Wolfman, who was in charge of writing this, said at some point, he said, "It was my policy not to kill any hero who was created before I was born. It was a silly rule, but I stuck to it for better or for worse." Now, I think Marv Wolfman was, I forget when he was born, sometime in the 50s or 60s, I think. So when he's talking about not killing off any superheroes who were created before he was born, he's talking about the golden age of superheroes, the 1930s and 40s. Now, I thought that's a perfectly good rule. You know, some respect for these heroes that kind of go back further than you. But that rule is clearly not in effect this time. A number of Golden Age superheroes bite the dust. But, you know, that's comic books. They've always kind of got to sell more comics by upping the shock value. Right from the very beginning, the Golden Age heroes, the Human Bomb and Uncle Sam, get killed off right in the opening pages. Now, I was sorry to see these heroes go. They've always been kind of some of my favorite comic book superheroes. I think both of these come from quality comics. Uncle Sam, right? You know, there's that Uncle Sam is an "I want you to join the U.S. Army," right? That kind of iconic Uncle Sam. In the 1940s, they made a comic book character of him, and I think he was supposed to be like the living embodiment of the American spirit. And he was, you know, just kind of classic Uncle Sam, like red, white, and blue hat, you know, the white goatee. Just, yeah, he was Uncle Sam, but he was a superhero now. It was an idea that was so cheesy and so terrible that that's part of the fun, really. Maybe this is just a personal preference, but one of the things that I found kind of fun or intriguing about DC Comics is because they have this long continuity, they have all these ridiculous characters from the 1940s, you know, from the era when these comic books were just American propaganda, that have just kind of stuck around, and they just kind of keep fitting into these various stories. Marvel comic books really doesn't have this as much because the Marvel comics largely started in the 1960s. There's the Timely comics, which were like the precursor of Marvel, where again you get like characters like Captain America, you know, some of these kind of cheesy patriotic characters. And some of them have stuck around a little bit in Marvel Comics, but not quite to the same extent. DC Comics just has loads of these kind of cheesy golden age superheroes in their archives. And as comic books have gotten more mature over the years, and we've kind of gone into kind of the darker, more mature era of comic books, these characters kind of fit awkwardly with kind of a more modern setting, but to my mind, that's all part of the fun, or part of the appeal of it, or I don't know, maybe I'm just weird, but no, it's not just me, because they keep bringing these characters back, so more people than me are obviously enjoying these characters. Now, back when this first came out in 2000, I keep saying 2006, but actually I think the original comic book came out in 2005. It was right during the Iraq War, and the character of Uncle Sam gets killed off. He's kind of beaten and then kind of left, the dead body is left in a pool of what looks like kind of oil. And so people thought that was a political statement, and yeah, maybe it was, I don't know. That comes through, I think, more in the comic than it does in the graphic novel. Now, of course, I kind of lament the fact that these characters are dead here, but we all know that nobody ever actually stays dead in comics. I think Wikipedia noted something I didn't actually catch, but Wikipedia noted in the comics, when these characters are all kind of being strung up, the original freedom fighters, Uncle Sam's body is not among them. So indicating that he's already been reincarnated, or the character is kind of off doing something later. And again, I think if you do follow Wikipedia, it turns out the character has come back to life or gone on to other adventures or something. The human bomb, they just get a new human bomb. Somebody else assumes the mantle of it. Now this gets into another issue about comic books, the fact that they're always kind of killing off superheroes and bringing them back, which at this point is just kind of so well established, it's almost pointless to complain about it. I mean, I know at one point people did complain about comic book deaths and how it was stupid to kill off these characters and bring them back, but now it just kind of seems kind of established as part of the genre, and it's, I don't know, maybe part of the fun. My own personal pet peeve is when they kill off a superhero and then they have somebody else just kind of take on that persona. So, you know, like they'll kill off the Blue Beetle, but then they'll have a new Blue Beetle. That I think is stupid to me. It just kind of, I mean, what's the point of killing him off then? Well, obviously the point is to sell more comics. But from a reader's standpoint, it's just stupid. If you're going to kill off the character, kill him off. I mean, fine, bring him back in 5 years, because we all know that nobody ever stays dead in comic books. But don't, like, kill off the Blue Beetle and then have, like, a new Blue Beetle. I think in this case, they killed off the human bomb, and then very quickly there was a new character who was had the mantle of the human bomb. I don't know. Okay. the other thing, and I guess it's kind of pointless to complain about this now as well, but yeah, comic books are really strange when you step back from it. And I think we've had this thing ever since, I think the big shift was in the 1980s. And that was a shift when, like, before then comic books had always been targeted at children. And then comic books started to be targeted more at like older teens or kind of grown men, where you had this kind of mature storylines, incredibly complicated continuity, and also the prices kind of shot up. So it was now kind of priced out of the range of most children. But yeah, and again, it's one of those things that there's no point complaining about it now because it's been established as this genre ever since the 1980s. But it does, when you're reading this book, every now and again, it's, you know, you get involved in the story, and it is kind of a decent story, decently complicated, lots of things going on. You know, the whole multiverse is arguably philosophical. And then you start to think to yourself, isn't it funny that there are all these grown men dressing up in masks and running around and fighting each other? And then there was this whole thing in Infinite Crisis where the Society of Villains forms and kind of tries to take over. You know, like, Society of Villains, what is that? I mean, it's like a children's view of the world that there's a Society of Villains. And like, fair enough, it is a children's view of the world because it's a comic book. But it's just one of the awkward things about how comic books are now becoming aimed at adult readers. But, you know, I guess this goes back to what I was just saying about Uncle Sam and the Freedom Fighters and these golden age comic book heroes that you kind of are so interesting just because they're so dated and cheesy. Maybe that's just comic books as a whole. I don't know. In the end, well, I guess there's no point recommending this, huh? If you're a comic book fan, you're going to check it out anyways. If you're not a comic book fan, you're probably very confused about this whole video and are not going to check it out. But for what it's worth, I largely enjoyed it.